The Scandinavian peninsula in the 8th century AD was a land forgotten by the world. There were no Roman columns here, no Byzantine domes, no Frankish castles, only endless forests, winding fjords, and long winter nights that seemed to go on forever. If you stood on the coast of Norway and looked inland, you would see mountains like the spines of giant beasts, one after another, stretching to the horizon. Between the mountains were deep fjords, seawater carving into the land, forming countless twisting waterways. Some of these fjords were as wide as rivers, some as narrow as alleyways, some so deep you couldn't see the bottom, some shallow enough to wade across. Along the coastline, countless small islands were scattered about, like pebbles casually tossed by a giant. This was a land embraced by the ocean, and also a land imprisoned by mountains. The forests of Scandinavia had a coverage rate exceeding 70%. Oak trees, pine trees, birch trees, towering into the clouds, blocking out the sky and sun. The trunks were so thick, it would take 3 or 4 adults to wrap their arms around them. The canopies so dense that even the noonday sun could only cast mottled shadows through the gaps. The forest was very quiet. Only the rustling sound of wind passing through the treetops, only the scuttling sound of squirrels leaping among the branches, only the call of some bird in the distance, long and lonely. The Vikings grew up in these forests. They knew which wood was the hardest, which wood was the most flexible, which wood was best for shipbuilding, and which wood was best for making fires. They knew where the wild boars were, where the deer were, where the bears were. They knew how to survive in the forest, how to hunt in the forest, how to find their way home after getting lost in the forest. The forest was their teacher, and also their enemy. In winter, when heavy snow sealed the mountains, the forest turned into a white tomb. Trees were bent by the accumulated snow. Branches snapped, making crisp breaking sounds. Wild beasts hid in their dens, birds flew south, and the entire world fell into deathly silence. Only the Vikings, wrapped in animal furs, chopped trees in the forest. Axes fell, trees hit the ground, making dull, thunderous sounds. Snowflakes rustled down from the tree crowns, as if the forest was weeping. If the forest is the skeleton of Scandinavia, then the fjords are its veins. These fjords are the legacy of the Ice Age. Tens of thousands of years ago, massive glaciers slid down from mountain peaks, cutting through rock, carving the earth, ultimately forming these deep waterways. When the glaciers melted and seawater flooded in, the fjords were born. The water of the fjords is bottomless. Some say the fjords can be 1,000 meters deep, or even deeper. Sunlight shining on the water's surface can only penetrate a few meters, and beyond that, it is eternal darkness. The waters of the fjord are also exceptionally calm. Even when the outer sea is rough and turbulent, the interior of the fjord is often tranquil and smooth, like a giant mirror reflecting the mountains and sky on both shores. The Viking villages are mostly built along the shores of the fjords. They fish here, build ships here, and live here. The fjords are their ports and also their roads. The mountain paths on land are rugged and difficult to traverse, but the waterways of the fjords extend in all directions, allowing boats to easily sail from one village to another. The fjords made the Vikings natural sailors. The latitude of Scandinavia is very high. The northern part of Norway even crosses the Arctic Circle. This means that winter nights are exceptionally long. In the northernmost regions, around the winter solstice, the sun doesn't even rise, and the entire world plunges into a polar night lasting several weeks. Even in the south, winter daylight only lasts a few short hours. At 9 in the morning, the sky barely gets light. At 3 in the afternoon, the sun starts to set. By 4 o'clock, it is already completely dark. The long winter nights are the Vikings' greatest enemy. Cold, darkness, loneliness, like 3 sharp blades piercing every person's heart. To fight against winter, the Vikings must make thorough preparations. In autumn, they would catch large quantities of fish, preserve them with salt, or dry them for storage. They would slaughter some of their livestock, smoking or air-drying the meat. They would gather berries, make yogurt, and prepare enough food to get through the long winter. They would also chop large amounts of wood and stack it outside their houses as fuel for winter. When the first snow fell, the Vikings would retreat into their longhouses. The longhouse was the typical Viking dwelling. Unlike the roundhouses inhabited by early British settlers, Viking houses were rectangular, reaching lengths of 20 to 30 meters and widths of about 5 to 6 meters. The walls of the houses were built from wood and stone, and the roofs were covered with turf or wooden planks for insulation. In the center of the house was a long fire pit. The fire burned day and night, its light illuminating the entire room and dispelling the cold. The Vikings sat around both sides of the fire pit, wrapped in animal furs, eating preserved fish and meat, drinking yogurt, and telling ancient stories. The firelight danced, and shadows flickered on the walls. Outside was the howling cold wind, the endless snow, the infinite darkness, but inside the longhouse there was warmth, there was light, there was the companionship between people. This was the Viking winter. The Scandinavian peninsula, though vast in area, had extremely limited arable land. Mountains occupied most of the land, forests covered the remaining space, and the plains truly suitable for farming were very few. Even in relatively flat areas, the soil was often barren and the climate too cold. Spring came very late, autumn came very early, and the growing season for crops was extremely short. Wheat and barley could barely ripen, but yields were very low. The situation for livestock was no better. Pastures were scarce, fodder insufficient, and cattle and sheep grew thin and small. In winter, livestock had to be kept indoors and fed stored hay. Otherwise they would freeze or starve to death. Only the Danish region had somewhat better conditions. Denmark was located at the southernmost tip of the Scandinavian peninsula, with lower latitude, relatively mild climate, and relatively fertile land. The conditions for farming and animal husbandry here were much better than in Norway and Sweden. But even Denmark could not compare with the prosperity of the European continent. The farmlands of the Frankish Empire stretched endlessly with rolling waves of wheat. The pastures of the British Isles were covered in lush green grass with herds of cattle and sheep. But Scandinavia had only rocks, forests, and ice and snow. This land could not support too many people. The reason the Vikings were able to maintain their unique way of life was closely related to the failure of the Roman Empire's expansion. From the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire was at its peak. The Roman legions swept across Europe, turning the Mediterranean into an inland sea and ruling half of Europe. Gaul was conquered, Britannia was conquered, Iberia was conquered, the Balkans were conquered. Rome's eagle standards were planted in every corner of the known world. The Romans also turned their gaze northward. That was the land of the Germanic peoples, the land of barbarians, the land of the uncivilized. The Romans believed that as long as they sent enough legions, the Germanic peoples would also kneel at Rome's feet, just like the Gauls. In 9 AD, Roman Emperor Augustus dispatched Varus to lead 3 legions deep into Germanic territory. These 3 legions, totaling more than 20,000 men, were well equipped and well trained, the most elite forces of the Roman Empire. Varus was full of confidence, believing that conquering the Germanic peoples was only a matter of time. But he was wrong. In the Teutoburg forest, the Germanic peoples set an ambush. The forest was dense, the roads narrow, and the Roman legions could not deploy their formations. Germanic warriors poured out from all directions, pouncing on the Roman soldiers like a pack of wolves. The battle lasted 3 days and 3 nights. The Roman legions were completely annihilated, and Varus committed suicide. It is said that when Augustus learned of this news, he was devastated with grief, banging his head against the wall and repeatedly shouting, "Varus, give me back my legions." The defeat at Teutoburg Forest completely ended the Roman Empire's northward expansion. The Romans abandoned their plan to conquer Germania, fixing their border along the Rhine and Danube rivers. From then on, the tribes of northern Europe were able to preserve their unique way of life, unaffected by Roman civilization. The Vikings were one of these tribes. Several centuries passed. The Roman Empire declined, split apart, and ultimately perished. The Germanic migrations destroyed the Western Roman Empire, establishing new kingdoms upon its ruins, and in the distant north, the Vikings still lived their ancient lives. They fished, they hunted, they farmed, they spent long winter nights in their longhouses, but a problem gradually emerged: the population grew. Although the Scandinavian peninsula was vast and sparsely populated, the area of arable land was fixed. As the population increased, land became increasingly insufficient. A father's land had to be divided among several sons. A son's land had to be divided among several grandsons. Generation after generation, the land was divided into smaller and smaller, more and more barren pieces. Some people didn't even get any land. They became landless peasants, became hired laborers, became wanderers. They drifted between villages, searching for work, searching for food, searching for a chance to survive. The internal contradictions of Viking society intensified. Conflicts between tribes, blood feuds between families, became more and more frequent. To fight for land, to fight for resources, the Vikings began killing each other. But when they raised their heads and looked south toward that warm and fertile land, a thought sprouted in their hearts. Why kill each other here? Why not go there, to that land with endless wealth? The Vikings were not completely isolated from the world. Through trade, through travel, through occasional contact, they knew of the existence of the outside world. They knew that in the south there was an empire called Francia, where the land was fertile, cities prosperous, and wealth piled up like mountains. They knew that in the west there was an island called Britain, where monasteries were magnificent, and gold, silver, and jewels were countless. They knew that in the east there was an empire called Byzantium, where the emperor lived in a golden palace and soldiers wore shining armor. These stories circulated in the Viking longhouses. Old men told them to young men, fathers told them to sons, generation after generation. These stories became more and more vivid, more and more enticing. Young Vikings, listening to these stories, had light flickering in their eyes. They imagined those fertile lands, imagined those mountains of wealth, imagined themselves piloting dragon-headed ships, riding the wind and breaking the waves, going to conquer that world. At the end of the 8th century AD, this thought finally turned into action. The Vikings began building more ships, bigger ships, faster ships. They sharpened their weapons, trained their combat skills, preparing for the expedition. An era was about to begin, an era that belonged to the Vikings. When the first ray of spring sunlight shines on the waters of the fjord, when the ice and snow begin to melt, when the longships slowly sail out of the harbor, the Vikings know their great adventure has begun. In the world of the Vikings, the gods have never left. They are above the clouds, in the thunder, in the pools of blood on the battlefield, deep in the heart of every Viking warrior. Unlike the god of Christianity, lofty and unreachable, the gods of the Vikings are touchable, can be spoken to, can be pleased with blood and courage. Odin is the All-Father. He has only one eye. The other eye was gouged out by himself, offered to the Well of Wisdom, in exchange for endless knowledge. He sits on the throne of Asgard with 2 ravens perched on his shoulders. One is called Thought, the other Memory. Every dawn these 2 ravens fly across the 9 realms, bringing back to Odin everything they see and hear. Odin knows everything. He knows which warrior is brave, which warrior is cowardly. He knows who will die gloriously on the battlefield, who will linger on miserably in bed. The Vikings believe that warriors who die in battle will be escorted by Odin's Valkyries to Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. That was a colossal palace, with 540 doors, each door wide enough for 800 warriors to pass through side by side. The palace's roof was laid with shields. The palace's pillars were supported by spears. In Valhalla, warriors fought during the day and feasted at night. They drank never-ending mead and ate forever fresh wild boar meat. Wounds would heal automatically, and fallen warriors would resurrect the next day to continue fighting. This was the Vikings' paradise. Not tranquility, not peace, but eternal battle. Thor, the god of thunder, was also the god of war. He was Odin's son, possessed immense strength, and wielded the mighty hammer Mjolnir. This hammer could shatter mountains, slay giants, and summon lightning. Thor was the most beloved god of Viking warriors, because he wasn't as unfathomably deep as Odin, nor as cunning and changeable as Loki. Thor was simple, direct, and brave, just like the Viking warriors themselves. Before going to war, Vikings would pray to Thor. They would carve the symbol of Mjolnir on their weapons, praying for Thor to grant them strength. They believed that as long as Thor was watching over them, they would not fail. Thunder was Thor's voice. When storms came, when lightning tore through the sky, when thunder roared, the Vikings knew Thor was fighting. He was battling giants, protecting the world of mankind. And Viking warriors like Thor had to prove their worth through battle. The Vikings' faith wasn't just about prayer and worship. It also included sacrifices, rituals, and pleasing the gods with blood. The most brutal ritual was called the Blood Eagle. This was an offering to Odin. The chosen sacrifice was usually an enemy leader or someone who had committed a grave crime. When the ritual began, the sacrifice would be forced to the ground, face down. The priest would use a sharp axe to hack through the ribs one by one, along both sides of the spine. Then the ribs would be pried outward and spread open like eagle's wings. Finally, the lungs would be pulled out and placed on top of the ribs. Throughout the entire process, the sacrifice had to remain silent. If he screamed out, then the sacrifice would fail, and his soul could not enter Valhalla. It was cruel, it was bloody, it is something modern people cannot understand. But to the Vikings, it was sacred. It was a way to show respect to Odin. a way to prove one's courage to the gods. Vikings also believed in the power of runes. Runes were an ancient script and also a form of magic. Each rune represented a power, a meaning. Vikings would carve runes on their weapons, praying for victory. They would carve runes on their shipbows, praying for safety. They would carve runes on amulets, praying for protection. The most common rune was the victory rune. It is made up of 3 intersecting lines like a simplified Thor's hammer. Before going to war, Viking warriors would carve this rune into their arms with a knife, then rub ash into the wound, making the rune permanently stay on their skin. They believed that as long as they had this rune on their body, they couldn't be killed. Even if hit by an arrow, the arrow would miss vital spots. Even if struck by a sword, the sword would be blocked by their shield. Runes were the Vikings' protective charms, and also their faith. The Vikings' faith fundamentally changed their attitude toward death. In the Christian world, people feared death, because after death they might go to hell, might suffer eternal punishment. So they prayed, they confessed, they tried to atone through good deeds. But Vikings didn't fear death, because they believed that dying in battle was glorious, was the only path to Valhalla. Dying of old age in bed was shameful, a sign of cowardice. People like that could only go to the underworld after death, spending eternity in darkness and cold. This belief made Viking warriors fearless on the battlefield. When the enemy's rain of arrows came, they wouldn't dodge. When the enemy's cavalry charged, they wouldn't retreat. They would raise their shields, swing their battle axes, charge at the enemy because they knew death is not the end. But the beginning, this psychological advantage was the Vikings' most powerful weapon. When you face an enemy who doesn't fear death, when you see the madness and desire in their eyes, you'll feel fear. You'll hesitate, you'll retreat, you'll think, why should I fight with such a lunatic? And the Vikings, they exploited this fear, defeating their enemies time and time again. Faith gave the Vikings their soul. It made them believe they weren't alone. The gods were watching them. The valiant spirits were waiting for them. The gates of Valhalla were open for them. It made them believe courage was above all else. Wealth could be lost, land could be lost, but honor could not be lost. It made them believe death wasn't the end. As long as they died in battle, they could live forever. This faith was the spiritual foundation of the Vikings' conquest of Europe. But no matter how powerful the faith, it still needed weapons to make it real. And the Vikings' weapons were precisely the sharp blades they used to conquer the world. The Viking warriors' weapons weren't complicated, no delicate decorations, no fancy carvings, no noble emblems, only simple, practical, deadly. An axe, a shield, a short sword. This was all the equipment a Viking warrior had. But it was these simple weapons that let them sweep across all of Europe. The Viking battle axe was a unique weapon. It wasn't like a knight's longsword that required years of training, nor like a spear that needed complex formation coordination. The battle axe was simple, direct, easy to learn. A farmer only needs a few weeks of training to master the basic use of a battle axe. The blade of a battle axe is very wide, usually 20 to 30 centimeters. The handle is about 1 meter long and can be used with one hand or both hands. The weight of the axe is concentrated at the front end, generating tremendous kinetic energy when swung. One axe strike can split a shield, cut through bones, and tear through armor. More importantly, a battle axe can not only chop but also hook. On the back of the blade, there is usually a hook. Viking warriors would use this hook to catch the edge of an enemy's shield, then pull hard to yank the shield away, exposing the enemy's body. This move was extremely effective on the battlefield. When an enemy's shield is pulled away, they lose their defense. At that moment, another Viking warrior would immediately charge forward and end the fight with an axe or short sword. The battle axe is the symbol of the Vikings, and also their faith. The Viking shield is round, about 1 meter in diameter, made from wooden planks joined together, covered with animal hide on the outside, with an iron boss in the center. The boss protrudes to protect the hand holding the shield, and can also be used to strike enemies. Round shields are very light, weighing only 5 to 7 kilograms. This means Viking warriors could hold their shields for long periods without feeling tired. They could move quickly, turn flexibly, and maintain mobility in combat. Another advantage of the round shield is its versatility. It can be used for defense, it can be used for attack, it can be used for pushing, it can be used for bashing. In a shield wall formation, round shields can be arranged tightly together, forming a solid line of defense in one-on-one combat. The round shield can move flexibly, protecting all parts of the body. Viking warriors would paint their shields with bright colors and draw various patterns on them. Some were geometric shapes, some were animal totems, some were family emblems. These patterns were not only decorative, but also symbols of identity. On the battlefield, when hundreds of colorful round shields lined up in a shield wall, that sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Vikings also carried short swords. This type of sword, about 50 to 70 centimeters long, double-edged, with a straight blade. It wasn't as fancy as a long sword, but equally deadly. The short sword was a close combat weapon. When the battle axe got stuck in an enemy's shield, when the distance was too close to swing the battle axe, Viking warriors would draw their short swords and stab at the enemy's throat, abdomen, or armpit. The thrust of a short sword was fast, precise, and lethal. Enemies often fell in pools of blood before they could even react. Viking short swords usually had no handguards. This was because Viking warriors were accustomed to using shields to protect their hands, rather than relying on the sword's handguard. The hilt was made of wood or animal bone, wrapped with leather on the outside to increase friction and prevent it from slipping out of hand during combat. Viking weapons, though simple, were crafted with excellent workmanship. They used a technique called pattern-welded steel. This technique involved repeatedly folding, forging, and welding iron bars of different hardness, ultimately forming a steel that was both hard and flexible. This kind of steel didn't break easily and didn't dull easily either. The surface of pattern-welded steel would display a unique wavy texture, like water ripples, like clouds, like a flowing river. This texture was not only beautiful but also a guarantee of quality. Viking blacksmiths were a respected profession. They held the secrets of forging, mastered the language of fire and iron. Before the roaring furnace they swung their hammers, forging rough iron ore into sharp weapons. Every weapon was a blacksmith's creation, a work of art. Viking warriors rarely wore armor, not because they didn't want to, but because armor was too expensive. A suit of chainmail required thousands of iron rings. Each ring had to be handmade, then linked together one by one. This took months of time, required large amounts of iron, and demanded superior craftsmanship. Only wealthy chieftains could afford chainmail. Ordinary Viking warriors could only wear leather armor, or simply wear no armor at all. They charged at enemies bare-chested, or wearing only a wool shirt, wielding battle axes and shields. This looked crazy, but in reality, it was a tactical choice. No armor meant lighter, faster, more agile. Viking warriors could move quickly, dodge swiftly, and deliver a fatal blow before the enemy could react. Moreover, Vikings believed that courage was more important than armor. If you are afraid of getting hurt, if you rely on armor for protection, then you've already lost. A true warrior should be fearless, should protect himself with his shield and skills, not hide behind armor. This philosophy made Viking warriors appear especially fierce on the battlefield. When enemies saw these bare-chested maniacs charging at them, swinging battle axes, they would feel fear, they would feel despair. And fear was the Vikings' best weapon. Among Viking warriors, there was a special kind of existence called berserkers. Before battle, they would enter a state of frenzy. Some say they would take certain herbs, some say they would perform special rituals, some say they were possessed by Odin. Whatever the reason, the berserkers' performance on the battlefield was beyond ordinary people. They wore no armor, didn't even wear clothes, only draped in bearskin or wolfskin. They bit the edges of their shields, letting out beast-like howls. Their eyes were bloodshot, foam at their mouths, as if they had lost their minds. When the battle began, berserkers would charge at the very front. They don't dodge, don't defend, only attack. They swing their battle axes, slaughtering all enemies standing in their way. Arrows hit them, they don't care. Swords strike them, they don't care. They have only one goal, killing. It is said that berserkers feel no pain, feel no fear, feel no fatigue. They are demons on the battlefield, the incarnation of death itself. Enemies who see berserkers often collapse, flee, give up resistance, because they know, facing such enemies, there is no chance of winning. The Viking conquest began with the sea. Without those elegant yet deadly longships, Vikings would forever be just farmers and fishermen on the Scandinavian peninsula, but they had longships. And so, the entire coastline of Europe became their hunting ground. The Viking longship's most striking feature is the dragon head carving at the bow. It is a huge wooden sculpture, usually in the image of a dragon or serpent. The dragon head rises high, mouth wide open, bearing sharp fangs, eyes wide open, as if staring at distant enemies. This is not merely decoration. The dragon head is a psychological weapon. When Viking longships slowly emerge from the sea fog, when those massive dragon heads appear on the horizon, when people on the shore see those ferocious faces, they feel fear. They know the Vikings have come. The dragon head has another purpose. It is the soul of the ship. The Vikings believed that dragon heads could protect ships, ward off evil spirits in the sea, and guide vessels to sail safely. Before setting out to sea, the captain would offer sacrifices to the dragon head, praying for safety. Before docking, the captain would remove the dragon head to avoid offending the spirits on land. The dragon head is the symbol of the Viking longship and the totem of the Vikings. The Viking longship is an engineering marvel. Its hull is made of oak. Oak is hard, durable, and resistant to rot, making it the best material for shipbuilding. The hull uses a clinker-built structure, where each plank overlaps with the next, then is fixed with iron nails, and the gaps are filled with animal hair and pine resin to prevent leaks. This structure makes the hull both sturdy and flexible. When waves strike the hull, the planks bend slightly, absorbing the impact, then return to their original shape. This means that Viking longships can sail through storms and huge waves without breaking apart. The hull is very shallow, with a draft of only about 1 meter. This is the most important feature of the Viking longship. Shallow draft means the ship can navigate in shallow waters, enter rivers, and charge directly onto beaches. The Vikings didn't need ports or docks. They could land anywhere. This gave them a huge tactical advantage. While enemies were still preparing their defenses, the Vikings had already stormed the beaches, while enemies were still mobilizing their armies. The Vikings had already plundered villages and then disappeared out to sea. Viking longships could use both sails and oars. In the center of the ship stood a tall mast. Hung on the mast was a huge square sail, usually woven from wool and dyed red, yellow, or in striped patterns. When the wind direction was favorable, the Vikings would raise the sail and let the wind push the ship forward. Although the square sail wasn't as flexible as the later triangular sails, with a tailwind, speeds could reach 15 to 20 kilometers per h-hour. When the wind direction was unfavorable, or when precise control of direction was needed, the Vikings would lower the sail and use oars. Each longship had 15 to 30 oar positions on each side. Each oarsman sat at their own position, gripping a long wooden oar, rowing in perfect unison to the rhythm of the drums. The oarsmen's movements had to be completely synchronized. If someone was too fast or too slow, the ship would veer off course and speed would drop. So Vikings started training in rowing from childhood until the movements became instinct. The coordination of sail and oars gave Viking longships unparalleled maneuverability. They could sail swiftly across the open sea, travel upstream in rivers, and turn flexibly in narrow waterways. This maneuverability was the key to the Vikings' conquest of Europe. The Vikings had no compass, no maps, no GPS, but they could cross the Atlantic, could reach Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. How did they do it? What the Vikings relied on was experience, observation, and intuition. They observed the position of the sun to determine direction. On clear days, the sun was the most reliable guide. The Vikings knew that the sun was due south at noon, in the east at sunrise, and in the west at sunset. They observed the positions of the stars to determine latitude. The North Star always pointed north, and the positions of other stars could tell them the ship's latitude. They observed the direction of the waves to determine wind direction. Different winds produced different waves. The Vikings could judge where the wind was coming from and where the ship should go by the shape and direction of the waves. They observed the flight of birds to determine the location of land. Certain birds only stayed near land. When the Vikings saw these birds, they knew that land was nearby. They also used a tool called a sunstone. This was a special crystal that could, on cloudy days, use the principle of polarized light to find the position of the sun. Although modern science still debates the authenticity of the sunstone, much evidence suggests that the Vikings did use similar tools. On a Viking longship, life was harsh. There were no cabins on the ship, no beds, no kitchen. Everyone slept on the deck, wrapped in animal hides or wool blankets to ward off the cold and sea wind. Food was simple: dried meat, dried fish, hard bread. Cheese foods could be preserved for a long time without spoiling. The Vikings would also bring some beer or mead, but water was the main drink. During long voyages, fresh water is the most precious resource. The Vikings would place wooden barrels on their ships to store fresh water, but the barrels had limited capacity, so they had to conserve water. Each person could only drink a small cup of water, but Dalton Y used to moisten their throat and replenish their strength. If they encountered a storm, the situation would get even worse. Waves would crash onto the deck, soaking everyone's clothes and food. The ship would rock violently, making it impossible to stand, sleep, or even eat. Some people would get seasick, vomiting non-stop, losing their fighting capability. But the Vikings endured all of this, because they knew that as long as they persevered, as long as they reached their destination, they could gain wealth, honor, and legend. To the Vikings, the longship was more than just a means of transportation. It was home, a weapon, a faith. Vikings would give their ships names and treat them like friends. They would carve runes on the ships, praying for protection. Before setting sail, they would offer sacrifices to the ship, thanking it for its service. When a Viking chieftain died, his ship would become his tomb. People would place his body on the ship, surrounded by his weapons, armor, jewelry, and slaves. Then they would set the ship on fire, letting the flames consume everything, letting the smoke rise toward the sky. The Vikings believed that this way the chieftain's soul could ride the ship and sail toward Valhalla. Ships are the wings of the Vikings, the tools with which they conquer the world, and the destination of their souls. The 8th of June, 793 AD. It was a calm summer morning. Lindisfarne Island off the northeastern coast of England was shrouded in mist. Waves gently lapped against the rocks, and seagulls circled in the air, letting out long cries. The monastery bells began to ring slowly. The monks awoke from their sleep, put on their coarse robes and walked toward the church, preparing to begin the day's prayers. They didn't know that death had already arrived from the sea. The morning sea fog was very thick. Visibility was only a few dozen meters. The monks chanted hymns in the church, their voices echoing between the stone walls, solemn and reverent. Suddenly, someone heard a strange sound. It was the sound of wood scraping against the beach, low, heavy, and continuous. A young monk walked to the window and looked out. The fog was thick, and he couldn't see anything clearly, but the sound grew closer and closer, clearer and clearer. Then the fog began to lift. The young monk saw a huge dark shadow emerging from the fog. It was a ship, a massive longship. The prow rose high, carved with a fierce dragon head, its mouth open as if ready to devour everything. On both sides of the ship were neatly arranged shields, red, yellow, black, like a colorful wall. The ship was packed with people. They were tall and large, with long hair and beards, wielding battle axes and spears. Their eyes were cold, their faces expressionless, like demons from hell. The young monk's heart stopped beating. He wanted to shout, wanted to run, but his body was stiff, unable to move. Then he saw more ships, 1, 2, 3, over a dozen longships, slowly emerging from the fog, like ghosts silently approaching the coast. The Vikings jumped off the ships and charged onto the beach. They didn't shout, didn't roar, only the sound of footsteps and weapons clashing. Their movements were swift, precise, and methodical. This wasn't their first raid. They knew what to do. The monastery's gate was wooden, very thick, but not locked. The Vikings hacked open the gate with battle axes and rushed into the courtyard. The monks panicked and scattered in all directions. Some ran toward the church, some toward the dormitories, some knelt on the ground praying, hoping God could save them. But God did not answer. The Vikings swung their battle axes, cutting down monk after monk. Blood splattered on the stone walls, on the holy icons, on the altar. The monks' screams echoed through the monastery, but soon the screams stopped, because no one could escape alive. After the slaughter ended, the Vikings began looting. They rushed into the church, smashed open the reliquary, and took all the valuable items. Golden crosses, gem-encrusted chalices, ornately decorated Bible covers, ivory-carved icons. These items that were sacred and inviolable in the eyes of the monks were just spoils of war in the eyes of the Vikings. They didn't care about the religious significance of these things. They only cared about their value. Gold could be melted down, gems could be sold, ivory could be carved into new decorations. The Vikings also took the monastery's food, wine, clothes, and tools. They emptied the storage rooms, emptied the kitchen, emptied every room. Then they set the monastery on fire. Flames devoured the wooden roof, devoured the books, devoured the murals. Thick smoke rose into the sky, visible from dozens of kilometers away. Not all monks were killed. Some young, strong monks were captured by the Vikings, tied up and dragged onto the ships. They would become slaves in Viking society. Slaves were important commodities. They could be sold to other places, could be used for labor, could be given as gifts to allies. These monks, who had once lived peaceful lives, praying daily, copying scriptures, tending gardens, were now locked in iron chains, forced aboard strange ships, sailing toward an unknown fate. Some would die during the voyage from disease, starvation, or despair. Some people would be sold to distant markets, becoming farmers, miners, or servants. Some people would spend the rest of their lives in foreign lands, never able to return home. The raid on Lindisfarne shocked all of Europe. This was no ordinary plunder. Lindisfarne Abbey was one of the most sacred places in England. Built in 635 AD, it was the center of Christianity's spread in Britain. Countless pilgrims came here to seek blessings. Countless scholars studied here, copying scriptures. It was a symbol of faith, a beacon of civilization. But now it had been destroyed. The news spread to the European continent, to the Frankish kingdom, to the papal court in Rome. People couldn't believe that someone dared to attack a monastery, dared to kill monks, dared to desecrate holy relics. Alcuin, a scholar from England, wrote in a letter to Charlemagne, "Never before has such terror occurred in Britain. Pagans came from the sea, as ferocious as wolves, as merciless as demons. They destroyed God's temple, killed God's servants, plundered God's wealth. Is this God's punishment for our sins?" People began to fear. If even monasteries weren't safe, then what place was safe? If even God's servants couldn't be protected, then how could ordinary people protect themselves? But to the Vikings, this was just a successful raid. They didn't understand the Europeans' shock and rage. In their culture, there was no concept of sacred and inviolable. Monasteries were no different from other buildings. Monks were no different from other people. The Vikings believed in Odin, Thor, and Freyr, not the Christian God. In their eyes, Christian monasteries were just wealthy, poorly defended, easy targets to attack. The monks wouldn't resist, wouldn't fight, they would only pray. This made the raids even easier. The monasteries had vast amounts of wealth, gold, silver, gems, exquisite crafts. These were all things the Vikings dreamed of. So, why not attack? The Vikings returned home with their spoils, with slaves, with the joy of victory. They held feasts in the longhouses, shared the plunder, and told stories of battle. Young men listened to these stories, their eyes gleaming with light. They too wanted to go to sea, to raid, to gain wealth and glory. The raid on Lindisfarne was only the beginning. After 793 AD, Viking raids became frequent. In 794 AD, they raided the monastery of Jarrow in Scotland. In 795 AD, they raided the coasts of Ireland. In 799 AD, they raided the coasts of the Frankish kingdom. Each raid followed the same pattern: sudden appearance, rapid plunder, swift retreat. Europe's coastlines became battlefields. Monasteries, villages, towns, all became targets of the Vikings. People began building watchtowers along the coast, assigning guards to monitor the sea day and night. When they spotted the dragon heads of Viking longships, the watchtowers would light beacons to warn inland residents. But often, the warning came too late. The Vikings were too fast, their raids too sudden. By the time reinforcements arrived, the Vikings had already disappeared into the sea, leaving only burning ruins and bodies everywhere. Europe entered a new era. An era filled with fear, chaos, and bloodshed. An era later generations would call the Viking Age. Coastal plundering was only the beginning. The Vikings soon discovered that the real wealth wasn't in the small villages by the sea, but in the cities inland. But the inland cities had high walls, armies, defenses. How to get there? The answer was rivers. Europe's rivers crisscrossed like blood vessels throughout the continent. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Elbe, the Volga. These rivers connected the ocean, and the interior connected villages and cities, connected the centers of civilization. For Europeans, rivers were transportation routes, trade passages, the source of life. For the Vikings, rivers were shortcuts for invasion. The shallow draft design of Viking longships allowed them to easily enter rivers. Even in places where the water was only 1 meter deep, the longships could still navigate. When the river was too shallow, the Vikings would get off the boats and drag them forward with ropes. When encountering waterfalls or rapids, the Vikings would carry the boats ashore, use logs as rollers, and push the boats around the obstacles. Nothing could stop them. In 841 AD, the Vikings traveled along the Seine River for the first time. Deep into the heart of the Frankish kingdom, their target was Rouen. Rouen was a wealthy city located on the banks of the Seine River, about 100 kilometers from the coast. The city had churches, markets, nobles' mansions, and a large amount of wealth. One early morning in May, the residents of Rouen woke up to see dozens of Viking longships floating on the river. The dragon heads loomed in and out of the morning mist, silent like ghosts. The city's garrison hurriedly assembled, but it was too late. The Vikings rushed ashore, broke through the city gates, and flooded into the streets. The battle was brief. Rouen's garrison was small in number, poorly equipped, and inadequately trained. They couldn't withstand the Viking assault. A few hours later, the city fell. The Vikings plundered the churches, burned down houses, killed those who resisted, and captured slaves. Then they returned to the sea along the Seine River with their spoils. The entire process took less than 3 days. The fall of Rouen was only the beginning. The Vikings discovered that along the Seine River they could reach even more cities. In 845 AD, Viking chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok led 120 longships up the Seine River. Their target was Paris. Paris wasn't the capital of France at the time, but it was already an important city. The city was located on a small island in the Seine River, surrounded by water, easy to defend and hard to attack. But the Vikings didn't care. They surrounded Paris and cut off all supply lines. The residents in the city panicked. They had never seen such a massive Viking fleet, never faced such a powerful enemy. Charles II, King of the Franks, sent troops to the rescue, but the Vikings set up an ambush on the riverbank and defeated the Frankish army. Charles II had no choice but to negotiate. He sent an envoy to the Viking camp with an offer. If the Vikings retreated, he would pay 7,000 pounds of silver as ransom. Ragnar thought it over and agreed. 7,000 pounds of silver was a huge fortune. Besides, the Vikings had already plundered many villages and towns along the Seine River and gained quite a lot. There was no need to keep fighting. The Vikings took the ransom and retreated. But they remembered one thing: the Franks were willing to trade money for peace. This meant they would be back next time. The ransom of Paris set a precedent. From then on, European rulers found that rather than fighting the Vikings, it was better to pay them to leave. This kind of ransom was called Danegeld. At first, the Danegeld wasn't much, a few £100 of silver or some gold and jewels, but as time went on, the amount got bigger and bigger. In 991 AD, the English king Thelda II paid £10,000 of silver in Danegeld. In 1012 AD, he paid £48,000 of silver. In 1018 AD, he paid £82,500 of silver. This money came from taxes, came from church donations, came from the property of nobles. The entire country was footing the bill for the Vikings' greed. But even after paying the Danegeld, the Vikings didn't necessarily keep their promises. Sometimes they'd take the money, then turn around and attack another city. Sometimes they'd take the money, then come back the next year demanding more. Danegeld wasn't a guarantee of peace, just a temporary breathing space. The Vikings didn't just sail on Western Europe's rivers, they also explored eastward. Swedish Vikings, called Varangians, sailed along the Baltic Sea into Eastern Europe's river systems. They followed the Neva River into Lake Ladoga. They followed the Volga River deep into the heartland of Russia. They followed the Dnieper River to the Black Sea. These rivers connected northern Europe, and the Byzantine Empire connected the cold forests and the warm Mediterranean. The Varangians established trading posts on these rivers, established settlements, established cities: Kiev, Novgorod, Smolensk. These cities were initially strongholds of the Varangians. They intermarried and merged with the local Slavs, ultimately forming a new ethnic group, the Russians. The name Russia comes from a Varangian tribe. Rus, rivers were not only transportation routes, but also battlefields. The Vikings encountered many enemies on the rivers. Sometimes it was the Frankish army, setting ambushes on the riverbanks, attacking the Viking longships with bows and catapults. Sometimes it was local nobles, organizing militias, building barriers at narrow points in the river to stop the Vikings from advancing. Sometimes it was other Viking tribes, competing for control of the same river. Battles on the rivers were often extremely fierce. Ships in narrow waterways couldn't turn around, couldn't flee, and could only engage head-on. The Vikings shot enemies with arrows, stabbed enemies with spears, hacked enemies with battle axes. Ships collided, planks shattered, blood stained the river water red. But most of the time the Vikings were the victors, because their ships were faster, their warriors were stronger, their tactics more flexible. Centuries later, when the Viking Age ended, when the longships no longer sailed, The rivers still remembered the shadows of those dragon heads. The Seine remembers how those warriors from the sea broke through the walls of Paris. The Volga River remembers how those blonde-haired, blue-eyed merchants established markets on its banks. The Danube River remembers how those brave explorers crossed the rapids to reach the Black Sea. Rivers were the roads by which the Vikings conquered Europe. Rivers are the marks left by the Vikings. Rivers are witnesses to history. Plundering, after all, is not a long-term solution. The Vikings soon realized that rather than risking raids on the same place every year, they might as well occupy it directly and make it their own territory. Thus, plunderers began to become settlers. Pirates began to become rulers. In 865 AD, a massive Viking army arrived in England. This army was called the Great Heathen Army. It was different from previous raiding parties. In the past, Vikings came and went, retreating after plundering. But this army brought their families, brought their tools, brought their seeds. They weren't here to plunder, they were here to settle. The army's leaders were the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar, Uber, Halfdan. Their father had supposedly died at the hands of King Thura of England, thrown into a pit of vipers. The sons came to England both for revenge and for conquest. England at that time was not a unified country, but composed of 7 small kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, Kent, Sussex, and Essex. These kingdoms often fought each other, weakening one another. The Vikings took advantage of this. They first attacked Northumbria and captured the city of York. York was an ancient city that had once been a military fortress of the Roman Empire. The city walls were tall, the streets were wide, and the population was large. The Vikings broke through the city gates, killed King Siva, and occupied the entire city. Then they renamed York, Jorvik, and turned it into the Viking capital. Next, they attacked East Anglia and killed King Edmund. Edmund refused to give up his Christian faith and refused to surrender to the Vikings. The Vikings tied him to a tree, shot him to death with arrows, and then cut off his head. Later, Edmund was canonized as a saint and became one of the patron saints of England. But at that time, his death was just one step in the Vikings' conquest of England. By the 870s AD, the Vikings had already occupied most of England. Only the kingdom of Wessex, under the leadership of King Alfred, was still resisting. Alfred was a clever and resilient ruler. He reorganized the army, built fortifications, and improved tactics. In 878 AD, he defeated the Viking army at the Battle of Edington, forcing the Viking leader Guthrum to sign a peace treaty. The treaty stipulated the Vikings could retain territory in northeastern England, a region called the Danelaw. Guthrum must accept Christian baptism and become Alfred's godson. The Vikings must not attack the kingdom of Wessex again. This was a compromise. Alfred could not completely expel the Vikings, but he preserved his kingdom. The Vikings could not conquer all of England, but they gained a vast territory. The Danelaw became the Vikings' permanent settlement in England. In the Danelaw, the Vikings began a new life. They were no longer pirates, but farmers, merchants, craftsmen. They established markets in Jorvik, selling furs, amber, ivory, slaves. They cultivated land in the countryside, growing barley, oats, vegetables. They built watermills on rivers to grind flour. They intermarried with the local Anglo-Saxons, having children. The two cultures began to merge. The Viking language influenced English. Many English words come from Old Norse. Sky, egg, knife, window. Husband. Viking law influenced England's legal system. Viking art influenced England's architecture and decoration. The Danelaw was no longer occupied territory but a new society, a society where Viking and Anglo-Saxon cultures blended together. England wasn't the only place settled by Vikings. In 911 AD, Charles III, king of the Franks, facing constant raids by the Viking chieftain Rollo, made a bold decision. He signed the Treaty of St. Clair sur Epte with Rollo. The treaty stipulated Rollo and his Vikings could settle in the lands along the lower Seine River, an area that later became known as Normandy, meaning land of the Northmen. Rollo must accept Christian baptism and become a vassal of Charles. Rollo must protect the coastline of the Frankish kingdom and defend against attacks from other Vikings. Rollo agreed. He accepted baptism, married a Frankish princess, and became Duke of Normandy. His Viking warriors also began to settle down, started learning French, and began integrating into Frankish society. But they didn't forget their roots. They retained the Vikings' courage, ambition, and adventurous spirit. A century and a half later, Rollo's descendant, Duke William of Normandy, would lead an army across the English Channel, conquer England, and become King of England. That conquest, called the Norman Conquest, was one of the most important events in European history. In Eastern Europe, the Varangians also established their own kingdom. In 862 AD, a Varangian chieftain named Rurik was invited to Novgorod and became the local ruler. The local Slavic tribes had long been caught in civil war, unable to establish a stable regime. They needed a strong leader, a ruler who could maintain order. Rurik accepted the invitation. He brought his warriors to Novgorod and established his rule. His successor, Oleg, continued to expand southward, occupying Kiev and establishing the Kievan Rus Principality. Kievan Rus is the common ancestor of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Its rulers were Varangians, its people were Slavs, its culture was a fusion of both. The settlement of the Vikings changed the political map of Europe. They were no longer foreign invaders, but part of European society. They established kingdoms, established principalities, established trade networks. Their descendants became kings, dukes, counts. Their bloodline flows through the veins of many European royal families. The English royal family has Viking bloodline. The French royal family has Viking bloodline. The Russian royal family has Viking bloodline. Vikings transformed from pirates into rulers, from plunderers into builders, but their spirit still remains. That yearning for the unknown, that love of adventure, that pursuit of freedom, that spirit will continue to drive them to explore farther places and conquer a broader world. In the longhouse of Jorvik, an old Viking sat by the hearth, telling stories of the past. He spoke of raids in his youth, of storms at sea, of the glory of battle. Children sat around him in a circle, their eyes gleaming with light. But the old man knew that era had already passed. His son was no longer a pirate, but a farmer. His grandson no longer spoke Old Norse, but spoke English. His great-grandson might not even remember the stories of the Vikings. But it didn't matter, because the blood of the Vikings still flowed through their veins, because the spirit of the Vikings still burned in their hearts, because the legacy of the Vikings had already merged into this land, merged into this world. The flames of the hearth burned slowly. The old man's voice gradually grew lower. Night fell over Jorvik. Everything returned to tranquility. Some Vikings were unwilling to settle in lands that had already been conquered. They were unwilling to bow to kings, unwilling to accept the rule of others, unwilling to give up freedom. So they sailed west, searching for a land without kings, without laws, without constraints. They found Iceland. In the 870s AD, Harald Fairhair, king of Norway, began to unite Norway. He defeated local petty lords and established a centralized kingdom. He demanded that everyone pledge loyalty to him, pay taxes to him, and obey his laws. Many Norwegians were unwilling to accept this kind of rule. They were used to freedom, used to self-governance, used to living their own way. The king's rule to them was a form of oppression, so they made a choice to leave. They packed their belongings, brought their families, boarded longships, and sailed west. They heard that in the distant west there was an island where there was no king, no ruler, only glaciers, volcanoes, and endless freedom. That island was called Iceland. Iceland was not discovered by the Vikings. As early as around 800 AD, Irish monks had already reached Iceland and established small hermitages there. They prayed, meditated, and copied scriptures there. But when the Vikings arrived, the monks left. They were unwilling to coexist with these pagans, unwilling to see their tranquility shattered. Thus, Iceland became a blank land, waiting for new masters. In 874 AD, a Norwegian nobleman named Ingstein IV Arnason became the first Viking to permanently settle in Iceland. He brought his family, slaves and livestock, and landed in a bay in southwestern Iceland. When his ship approached the shore, he threw his high seat pillars, wooden pillars symbolizing family honor, into the sea, vowing to settle wherever the high seat pillars drifted to. A few days later, his slaves found the high seat pillars in a steaming bay. There were hot springs, steam and smoke. Ingfra named the place Reykjavik, meaning smoky bay. Today Reykjavik is the capital of Iceland. Over the next few decades, thousands of Norwegians came to Iceland. They searched along the coastline for suitable places to settle, claimed land, and built farms. Iceland's land was distributed on a first-come, first-served basis. The first to arrive could claim as much land as possible. The rule was simple. The land a person could claim was the area they could walk across in one day while lighting bonfires. Men walked from sunrise to sunset. Women walked from sunrise to sunset, and the land they walked across became their land. Some claimed vast pastures, Some claimed fertile river valleys, some claimed fishing grounds near the coast. By 930 AD, all habitable land in Iceland had been claimed. The settlement age came to an end. Iceland was a unique society. It had no king, no central government, no standing army. Power was held in the hands of local chieftains who were called Goai. Each chieftain controlled a territory, had their own followers, and was responsible for maintaining order, resolving disputes, and presiding over religious ceremonies. But chieftains were not hereditary, nor were they absolute. People could choose which chieftain to follow, could change chieftains, and could challenge a chieftain's authority. This was a society based on free choice and personal honor, to coordinate chieftains from different areas and to resolve cross-regional disputes. The Icelanders established a unique institution, the Alþingi. The Alþingi is one of the oldest parliaments in the world. Every summer, all chieftains and freemen would gather at Ingvellir. Ingvellir is a plain located in southwestern Iceland, surrounded by mountains and lakes. There is a massive rift valley here, at the boundary between the North American and Eurasian plates. The earth splits open here, forming a deep canyon. The Vikings believed this was a place chosen by the gods, a symbol of law and justice. During the Alþingi, people would set up tents and build temporary camps. The chieftains would gather at the law rock Ligberg to discuss laws, hear cases, and resolve disputes. The law speaker, Ziguma, would stand on the rock and recite Iceland's laws aloud. Because there were no written records at the time, all laws were passed down orally. The law speaker had to memorize all the laws and recite them once a year at the Alþingi to ensure people wouldn't forget. This was a sacred duty and also a huge challenge. Icelandic society was built on the foundation of honor and revenge. If a person is killed, his family has both the right and the obligation to avenge him. This is called a blood feud. Blood feuds can last for several generations and can lead to long-term wars between families. But Icelanders also have a way to resolve blood feuds, compensation, if the killer is willing to pay compensation. And if the victim's family is willing to accept it, the blood feud can end. The amount of compensation depends on the social status of the victim. Killing a chieftain requires paying more compensation. Killing a slave only requires paying very little compensation. This is an unequal society, but also an orderly one. Icelanders love stories. During the long winter nights, when blizzards block the roads and darkness covers the land, people gather in the longhouses, sit around the fireplace, and tell stories. They tell of their ancestors' adventures, of heroes' battles, of love and betrayal, of honor and revenge. These stories are called saga. Sagas were originally passed down orally, from one generation to the next. By the 13th century AD, Icelanders began to write down the sagas, recording them with parchment and ink. These sagas became treasures of Nordic literature and important sources for understanding the Viking Age. Engel Saga tells of a blood feud that lasted for decades. Egil's Saga tells of the life of a poet-warrior. The Saga of Grettir tells the tragedy of an exiled hero. These stories are not just entertainment, they are the history of Icelanders, the identity of Icelanders, the soul of Icelanders. In the year 1000 AD, Iceland faced a major choice. Most of Europe had already converted to Christianity. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway demanded that Icelanders also accept Christianity. He sent missionaries to Iceland, threatening that if Icelanders refused, he would send an army to invade. Icelanders fell into division. Some were willing to accept Christianity, while others insisted on believing in the ancient Norse gods. Both sides argued fiercely at the Althing, nearly breaking into civil war. Finally, the law speaker Thorgeir made the decision. He pondered in his tent for a day and a night, then came out and announced, "Iceland will accept Christianity, but people can continue to believe in the old gods in private." This was a compromise, a wise compromise. Iceland avoided civil war, maintained unity, but also preserved a degree of religious freedom. From then on, Iceland became a Christian nation, but the ancient beliefs did not completely disappear. They merged into folklore, merged into the sagas, merged into the memory of Icelanders. Iceland is a land of contradictions. Here there are glaciers and also volcanoes. Here there is polar night and also polar day. Here there are harsh winters and also brief summers. Here there is loneliness and there is freedom. The Vikings established a unique society here, a society without a king, a society based on law and honor. They created great literature here, recording the history and mythology of the North. They survived here, multiplied here, dreamed here. Iceland, the last land of freedom for the Vikings. Their refuge from oppression, their fortress for preserving tradition, the symbol of their spirit. On the night of the summer solstice, Iceland's sun does not set. It moves slowly along the horizon, from west to north, from north to east, never sinking. The sky is pale blue, the clouds are golden, the earth is green. An old man stands on the hillside, gazing into the distance. He sees glaciers, sees volcanoes, sees the ocean. He remembers the stories of his ancestors, remembers their journey sailing here from Norway. He remembers how they fought for freedom, lived for honor, died for dreams. He knows that era has passed, but the spirit still remains. On this land of ice and fire, on this land of freedom, on this land of the Vikings. The sun continues to move along the horizon. Night never comes. Some Vikings, even after reaching Iceland, still weren't satisfied. Their eyes looked toward the farther west. Their hearts longed for more distant horizons. So they continued to sail, crossing the icy seas, searching for new lands. They found Greenland. Then they found America. In 982 AD, a man named Erik Thorvaldsson was sentenced by the Icelandic Althing to 3 years of exile. His crime was murder. In a dispute, he killed his neighbor, triggering a blood feud. Although he tried to reconcile, he was ultimately sentenced to exile. Erik had fiery red hair, a hot temper, and a stubborn personality. People called him Erik the Red. He was unwilling to wait 3 years in Iceland, unwilling to endure the humiliation and loneliness. He decided to sail west, searching for the legendary land. Decades ago, a sailor named Gunnby Björn had lost his way in a storm and saw land to the west. That land was covered with glaciers shrouded in mist, looking desolate and terrifying. No one dared to go there, but Erik wasn't afraid. He packed his belongings, took his family and followers, boarded a longship, and sailed west. After several days of sailing, Erik saw land. It was a huge island, much larger than Iceland. The island's east coast was covered with thick glaciers, cold and desolate. But when Erik sailed around to the southwest coast, he saw a different scene. Here there were fjords, grasslands and shrubs. In summer the grassland is green, wildflowers bloom and birds sing. Here you can graze cattle and sheep, you can plant crops, you can survive. Erik spent his 3-year exile here. He explored the coastline, searching for the most suitable place to settle. He gave this land a name, Greenland, meaning Greenland. This name was somewhat exaggerated. Most of Greenland is covered by glaciers and is not green. But Erik was a clever man. He knew that if he wanted to attract more settlers, he needed an attractive name. Greenland sounds much better than Iceland. In 985 AD, Erik's exile ended. He returned to Iceland and began recruiting settlers. He described to people the beautiful scenery of Greenland, described the grasslands and fjords there, described the opportunities and freedom there. Many Icelanders were moved by his words. Iceland's land had already been fully occupied. Newcomers found it hard to find good land, and Greenland was a blank land, waiting for new masters. In 986 AD, 25 longships departed from Iceland for Greenland. The ships carried about 500 people, along with cattle, sheep, horses, tools, and seeds. But the voyage was not smooth. The North Atlantic Ocean is treacherous and merciless. Storms hit the fleet and huge waves swallowed some ships. In the end, only 14 ships reached Greenland. About 350 people landed on the southwestern coast of Greenland. They established 2 settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. The Eastern Settlement, located at the southernmost tip of Greenland, was the main settlement area. The Western Settlement, located about 500 kilometers to the north, was smaller in scale. The Vikings in Greenland lived a harsh life. The climate here was colder than Iceland. Summers were short, winters were long. The land was barren. Crops were hard to grow. They mainly relied on herding for a living, raising cattle, sheep, and goats. They also hunted seals, whales, and reindeer. They used seal oil for lamps, seal skin to make clothes, and seal meat to satisfy their hunger. They traded with the Inuit, the local indigenous people, exchanging furs, ivory, and other goods. But they also had conflicts with the Inuit. Both sides fought over hunting grounds, over resources, and sometimes battles would break out. The Vikings in Greenland maintained contact with Europe. They paid taxes to the Norwegian king and tithes to the church. They exported precious goods like walrus ivory, polar bear pelts and falcons. In return, they imported necessities like timber, ironware, and grain. Greenland had no trees, all timber had to be imported from outside. This made the Vikings in Greenland highly dependent on trade with the outside world. Around 1000 AD, the son of Eric the Red, Leif Erikson, heard a story. A merchant named Jarni Herjolfsson lost his way while sailing from Iceland to Greenland. He drifted westward and saw a strange land. That land was covered with forests and looked warm and fertile. But Jarni did not land. He continued sailing and eventually reached Greenland. Leif was very interested in this story. He was an adventurer, eager to explore the unknown world. He bought the ship from Bjarni, recruited 35 sailors, and sailed west. They first reached a desolate land with only rocks and glaciers. Leif named it Helluland, meaning land of flat stones. Today, this land is believed to be Baffin Island in Canada. They continued sailing south and reached a land covered with forests. Leif named it Markland, meaning land of forests. Today, this land is believed to be Labrador in Canada. They sailed south again and reached a warm and fertile land. There were grasslands, rivers, and wild grapevines. Leif named it Vinland, meaning land of wine. Today, this land is believed to be Newfoundland in Canada. Leif and his sailors spent the winter in Vinland. They built houses and explored the surrounding land. The climate here was much warmer than Greenland. Winter wasn't too cold, summer was long, the grasslands were fertile, and the rivers had salmon. This is an ideal land suitable for settlement, but Leif did not stay. The following spring he returned to Greenland with a full load of timber and grapes. He told people the story of Vinland, about the forests and meadows there, about the opportunities and wealth there. In the following years, other Vikings also attempted to settle in Vinland. Leif's brother Thorvald led an expedition to Vinland, but was killed in a conflict with the local natives. A merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni led about 160 people to Vinland, attempting to establish a permanent colony. They lived there for 3 years, but ultimately abandoned it due to ongoing conflicts with the natives. The natives, whom the Vikings called Skreling, meaning barbarians, they were probably Inuit or Native Americans. They were angered by the Viking invasion and constantly launched attacks. Although the Vikings had better weapons, they were too few in number to resist. In the end, the Vinland colony was abandoned, but the Vikings didn't completely leave America. Over the following centuries, Vikings from Greenland continued to go to Markland, cutting timber and bringing it back to Greenland. In 1960, archaeologists discovered Viking remains at Lansauk Meadows in Newfoundland. This is solid evidence of Viking settlement in America. This proves that the Vikings reached America 500 years before Columbus. The Viking colony in Greenland lasted for about 500 years, but starting from the 14th century, the colony began to decline. The climate got colder. This was the beginning of the Little Ice Age, where global temperatures dropped and glaciers expanded. Greenland's summers became shorter, and winters became longer. Grasslands decreased, and livestock struggled to survive. Trade with Europe was also cut off. The Black Death swept through Europe, the population plummeted, and the economy collapsed. Norway and Iceland no longer had the capacity to support the colony in Greenland. Ships stopped coming, supplies stopped being delivered. The Vikings in Greenland fell into isolation. They had no timber to repair ships, no iron tools to make equipment, no grain to fill their stomachs. They tried to adapt, tried to survive. They learned the Inuit way of life, hunting seals, building igloos, but their culture, their identity, their traditions gradually disappeared. In 1408 AD, the last recorded European ship visited Greenland. After that, there was no more news. In 1540 AD, when Europeans reached Greenland again, the Viking colony had vanished. Houses were empty, churches were abandoned, graveyards were desolate. No one knows what happened to the last Vikings. Did they die of famine? Were they killed by the Inuit? Did they leave Greenland and go somewhere else? No one knows. Only the wind howling through the ruins. Only the glaciers, shining in the sunlight. Only silence, echoing through time. Greenland and Vinland were the endpoints of Viking expansion. They reached the end of the world, reached the edge of the known world. They established colonies there, lived there, dreamed there, but in the end they failed. Not due to lack of courage, not due to lack of skill, but because the environment was too harsh, the distance too vast, the support too weak. The Vikings were great navigators, brave explorers. But they were also human, with human limitations, with human fragility. Their story is a story about courage and adventure. It is also a story about failure and disappearance. In the ruins of Greenland, in the forests of Vinland, their footprints still remain, reminding us that once there was a group of people who dared to dream, dared to venture, dared to reach the end of the world. All eras come to an end. All legends draw to a close. The Viking Age was no exception. From the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD to 1066 AD, the Vikings roamed across Europe for nearly 300 years. They plundered, they conquered, they settled. They changed the face of Europe. But by the mid-11th century, everything was changing. The Vikings were no longer symbols of terror. They became kings, became Christians, became part of Europe, and the Viking Age came to an end in two decisive battles. On the 5th of January 1066 AD, Edward the Confessor, King of England, died. He had no children, no clear heir. The throne of England fell into contention. 3 men claimed they had the right to inherit the throne. The first was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful nobleman in England, Edward's brother-in-law. On the very day of Edward's death, he was chosen as king by the Witan. The second was Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, meaning Harold the Ruthless. He was a legendary Viking warrior who had once served in the Byzantine Empire and participated in countless battles. He claimed that, according to previous agreements, the King of Norway had the right to inherit the English throne. The third was William, Duke of Normandy, later known as William the Conqueror. He was a distant cousin of Edward, claiming that Edward had once promised to pass the throne to him. None of the 3 was willing to give up. Thus, war was inevitable. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada led a massive Viking army to invade northern England. His fleet had over 300 longships, carrying approximately 10,000 warriors. This was the last large-scale invasion by the Vikings. Harold landed in Yorkshire, defeated the local English army, and occupied the city of York. He demanded that the English recognize him as king, or else continue fighting. But Harold Godwinson was unwilling to submit. He led his army on a rapid march north from London at a surprisingly fast pace. On the 25th of September, Harold's army arrived at Stamford Bridge, a small village near York. Harold's army was resting there, not expecting the English army to arrive so quickly. Many Viking warriors weren't even wearing armor or carrying weapons. The battle began. The English army launched an attack from one end of the bridge. The Vikings hastily engaged, trying to hold the bridge. Legend has it that one giant Viking warrior single-handedly held the bridge, killing over 40 English soldiers. He swung his great axe, roaring like a wounded bear. No one could get close to him. No one could cross the bridge. Finally, an English soldier rowed a small boat around under the bridge and stabbed him from below with a spear. The giant fell, and the bridge was lost. The English army surged across the bridge and engaged in fierce combat with the Vikings. The battle lasted several hours. Corpses piled up like mountains and blood stained the river red. Harald Hardrada was struck in the throat by an arrow during the battle and died on the spot. His army, having lost their leader, began to fall apart. The Vikings desperately fled, trying to get back to their ships, but the English army pursued relentlessly, killing most of the fleeing soldiers. In the end, only 24 ships, carrying the survivors, returned to Norway. Over 300 ships came, 24 ships went back. This was one of the Vikings' most devastating defeats. The Battle of Stamford Bridge marked the end of the Viking Age in England, but Harold had no time to celebrate his victory. Just 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge ended, he received news. Duke William of Normandy had landed in southern England. Harold had to lead his army once again, marching south in haste. His soldiers had just experienced a bloody battle and were utterly exhausted. But they had no time to rest, no time to recover. They had to march immediately to face a new enemy. On the 14th of October, the 2 armies met near Hastings. Harold's army occupied a small hill, forming a shield wall formation. William's army, including cavalry, archers, and infantry, launched an attack from the foot of the hill. The battle lasted all day. The Norman cavalry charged the shield wall again and again, but were repelled each time. The English shield wall was solid as iron, impossible to break through. But William was a cunning commander. He ordered part of his army to feign retreat, luring the English soldiers to pursue. Some English soldiers left the shield wall, chasing the fleeing Norman soldiers. At this moment, the Norman cavalry suddenly turned around, surrounded and killed these pursuers. The shield wall had a gap. The Norman army seized the opportunity to launch a general offensive. At dusk, Harold was shot in the eye by an arrow and fell on the battlefield. His army, having lost their king, began to collapse. William won the victory. He became the King of England, known as William the Conqueror. The Battle of Hastings changed the history of England, but ironically, the victor William was himself a descendant of the Vikings. His ancestors were Vikings who settled in Normandy in the 10th century. They adopted Frankish culture, spoke French, believed in Christianity, and became Normans. But in their blood, Viking blood still flowed. Their combat skills, their adventurous spirit, their desire for conquest, all came from their Viking ancestors. So the Battle of Hastings was not the defeat of the Vikings, but the transformation of the Vikings. They were no longer raiders, but conquerors. They were no longer pagans, but Christians. They were no longer outsiders, but rulers. After William conquered England, he brought Norman culture, law, and language. England's nobility was replaced by Norman nobility. English absorbed a large amount of French vocabulary. England's architecture saw the emergence of Norman-style castles and churches. All of England was thoroughly transformed, and all of this stemmed from the Vikings. The end of the Viking Age was not just military, but more importantly cultural. Starting from the 10th century, the Vikings gradually accepted Christianity. Danish King Harald Bluetooth converted to Christianity around 960 AD and began promoting Christianity in Denmark. Norwegian King Olaf Tryggvason, after becoming king in 995 AD, forcibly imposed Christianity, destroying pagan temples and executing those who refused to convert. Sweden was the last Scandinavian country to accept Christianity, not becoming fully Christianized until the 12th century. The spread of Christianity changed every aspect of Viking society. The old gods Odin, Thor, Freyr were forgotten. The old rituals, sacrifices, divination, runic magic were banned. The old values, honor, revenge, dying in battle, were replaced by new values, humility, forgiveness, eternal life. The Vikings no longer believed in Valhalla, no longer yearned to die in combat. They began to believe in heaven and hell, began to yearn for the salvation of their souls. Churches replaced temples. Priests replaced the pagan clergy. The Bible replaced the Eddas. Viking culture gradually disappeared into the river of history. But the story of the Vikings did not completely vanish. In Iceland, the descendants of the Vikings began to record the stories of their ancestors in writing. These records are called sagas, meaning stories or legends. Sagas are prose works written in Old Norse, telling stories of heroes, kings, explorers, and settlers from the Viking Age. The most famous sagas include Egil Saga, which tells the life of the poet-warrior Egil Skallagrimsson, Engel Saga, which tells of blood feuds and legal disputes in Iceland, the Saga of the Greenlanders, and Eric the Red's Saga, which tell of explorations to Greenland and Vinland, Heimskringla, which tells the history of the Norwegian kings. These sagas are our primary sources for understanding the Viking Age. They are not merely historical records, but literary works full of drama, poetry, and philosophical reflection. They preserve the Vikings' language, culture, values, and worldview. They allow us to hear the voices of the Vikings, see the world of the Vikings, and feel the souls of the Vikings. The Viking Age has ended, but the legacy of the Vikings still remains. In language, many words in English come from Old Norse, such as sky, egg, knife, and window. In place names, many place names in northern and eastern England, ending with by, village, thorpe, farm, and thwaite, clearing, were all left by the Vikings. In law, England's jury system originated from the Viking thing system. In culture, Norse mythology, the stories of Odin, Thor, and Loki still circulate in modern culture, appearing in movies, novels, and games. In bloodlines, the genes of modern British, Irish, French, and Russian people all carry traces of the Vikings. The Vikings didn't disappear, they merged into Europe and became part of Europe. Their spirit of adventure, their desire to explore, their ability to adapt, still continue in their descendants. In 1066, the battles of Stamford Bridge and Hastings marked the end of the Viking Age. The last Viking warriors fell on the land of England. Their longships no longer set sail, their battle axes no longer swing, their war songs no longer echo. Dusk fell, night came, but in the darkness the stars still shine. The stories of the Vikings are still being told. The spirit of the Vikings is still being passed down. They were warriors, explorers, poets, dreamers. They changed the world and were changed by the world. Their era has ended, but their legend will never end. In the northern wind, in the ocean waves, in the Icelandic sagas, in our memories the Vikings still live on. Time flows like a river, 1,000 years have passed. The longships of the Vikings have long since rotted in the earth. The castles of the Vikings have long since turned to ruins. The warriors of the Vikings have long since turned to dust. But their stories still echo on. In the northern winds, in the ocean waves, in our memories. In the 19th century, when Europe entered the industrial age, when people began to examine history with a scientific eye, the remains of the Vikings started to be rediscovered. In Oslo, Norway, archaeologists discovered the Oseberg ship, a well-preserved Viking burial ship, burying 2 women, possibly a queen or priestess. The ship was filled with exquisite carvings, textiles, furniture, and everyday items, showcasing the Vikings' superb craftsmanship and rich culture. In Jelling, Denmark, archaeologists discovered 2 massive mounds burying the Danish king Gorm and his wife. Next to them stand 2 runestones, one of which was erected by Harald Bluetooth, proclaiming that he unified Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. This stone is called Denmark's birth certificate. In Birka, Sweden, archaeologists discovered a Viking Age trading city with thousands of graves yielding items from all over the world. Arabian silver coins, Byzantine silk, Chinese beads. This proved that the Vikings' trade network extended to the entire known world. In York, England, archaeologists discovered Jorvik, the Viking city preserved with its streets, houses, workshops, and docks. There, they found Viking shoes, combs, toys, tools, and even fossilized feces, allowing us to understand the daily life of the Vikings. In Iceland, archaeologists discovered the earliest settlements, preserved with the remains of longhouses as well as seeds, bones, and tools brought by the Vikings. In Greenland, archaeologists discovered the ruins of Viking colonies, churches, farms, cemeteries, quietly lying in the shadow of glaciers. At Lansauk Meadows in Newfoundland, archaeologists discovered a Viking settlement in the Americas, proving that the Vikings reached the New World 500 years before Columbus. Each discovery brings us closer to the Vikings. Each artifact tells their story. In the 21st century, as science entered the genetic age, we began using DNA to trace the Vikings' footsteps. Scientists extracted DNA from ancient bones, analyzing the genetic composition of the Vikings. They discovered that the Vikings were not a single race. They came from different regions with different genetic backgrounds. The Vikings of Denmark had close ties with the populations of northern Germany. The Vikings of Norway had close ties with the populations of western Sweden. The Vikings of Sweden had close ties with the populations of the Baltic region. The Vikings were a cultural group, not a racial group. What they had in common wasn't bloodline, but language, culture, and way of life. Scientists also tracked the migration routes of the Vikings. They found that Viking genes are widely distributed throughout Europe. In northern England, about 6% of the population has Viking genes. In Iceland, almost everyone has Viking genes. In Western Russia, many people have Viking genes. In Normandy, France, many people have Viking genes. Even in the Mediterranean region, traces of Viking genes have been found. The Vikings didn't disappear. They merged into Europe and became part of Europe. Their blood flows through our veins. Their genes continue in our cells in the 20th and 21st centuries. Viking culture experienced a revival. In literature, Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings was deeply influenced by Norse mythology and Viking legends. In music, Nordic metal bands like Amon Amarth and Wardruna sing epics of Viking warriors. In film and television, works like Vikings and Twilight of the Gods retell the stories of the Vikings. In games, works like Assassin's Creed Valhalla and God of War let players experience the world of the Vikings. At festivals, Nordic countries hold Viking festivals where people dress in Viking costumes and recreate life from the Viking Age. In academia, Viking studies has become an important field, attracting scholars from around the world. The Vikings have once again become part of popular culture, but this time they are no longer symbols of terror, but symbols of courage, adventure, and freedom. People are drawn to their stories, moved by their spirit, and inspired by their legends. But we must also acknowledge that modern imagination of the Vikings is not entirely accurate. Many Viking images in popular culture are romanticized and simplified. Vikings were not all savage warriors. They were also farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and poets. They had complex social structures, laws and order, art and culture. Vikings did not all wear horned helmets. This was an invention of 19th century Romantic artists, with no archaeological evidence to support it. Vikings were not all blonde-haired, blue-eyed Nordics. Their appearances were diverse. Some had dark hair, some had brown eyes. Vikings were not all male warriors. Women played important roles in Viking society, and some women were even warriors. In 2017, scientists reanalyzed a famous Viking warrior grave and discovered the occupant was female, overturning traditional notions. Vikings were not all brutal raiders. They were also peaceful settlers who intermarried with locals and integrated into local societies. The real Vikings are more complex, more human, and more interesting than the mythical Vikings. They were not supermen, not monsters, but people with strengths, with flaws, with dreams, with fears. They, like us, are searching for their place in this world, searching for the meaning of survival. The story of the Vikings makes us think about some eternal questions. What is courage? Is it swinging a battle axe on the battlefield, or sailing on unknown oceans? Is it conquering others or conquering one's own fear? What is freedom? Is it plundering without restraint, or building a home on new land? Is it rejecting authority, or creating one's own destiny? What is honor? Is it dying in battle, or living for family and community? Is it revenge, or forgiveness? What is home? Is it the place where you were born, or the place you choose? Is it bonds of blood, or shared experiences? The Vikings with their lives answered these questions. Their answers may not be correct, but they're definitely sincere. They lived passionately, lived authentically, lived without regrets. Imagine a Viking warrior standing at the bow of a longship. The sun sets in the west, dyeing the sea surface golden. Wind blows through his hair, waves slap against the hull. He looks back, seeing the shores of his homeland, gradually disappearing on the horizon. He looks forward, seeing the unknown ocean, stretching to the ends of the world. He doesn't know what lies ahead, doesn't know what he'll encounter, but he is not afraid. Because he is a Viking, because in his blood flows the gene of adventure, because in his soul burns the flame of exploration, he raises his hand, saluting the sky, saluting Odin, saluting Thor, saluting all the gods. Then he turns around, facing the sea, continuing to sail, sailing towards the unknown, towards dreams, towards eternity. 1,000 years later, we stand on the same shore. The waves still crash against the rocks, the wind still blows through the fjords. But the Viking longships are no longer there, only echoes reverberating through time, in the sagas of Iceland, in the museums of Norway, in the place names of England, in our genes. The story of the Vikings has not ended. It continues in the heart of everyone who dares to dream. It continues in the footsteps of everyone who dares to take risks. It continues in the eyes of everyone who dares to explore. The Viking Age has ended, but the Viking spirit will never end. Because as long as there are people gazing at the stars, longing for distant places, as long as there are people setting sail, chasing dreams, Vikings are still alive. In the northern wind, in the waves of the ocean, in our hearts forever. Night has fallen. Stars shine in the sky like the souls of Viking warriors. The moon rose, illuminating the silent fjord. Everything quieted down. Everything became peaceful. The story of the Vikings is finished, but their legend will never be forgotten. In our dreams, we can still hear the oars of the longships. In our dreams, we can still see the figures of the warriors. In our dreams, we can still feel the passion and glory of that era. Now, let us close our eyes. Let us drift into the distance with the northern wind. Let us sink into slumber with the ocean waves. The story of the Vikings has ended, but our dream has just begun. Good night, warriors. Good night, explorers. Good night, dreamers. May you feast forever in the halls of Valhalla. May your names be sung forever. May your spirit inspire us forever.